Here's where I want to wrap up, is what we can know about the real Jesus. What can we know about the real Jesus, about the historical Jesus? What can we know? Now, I want to suggest, and that's on the next slide, so go ahead and go to that. I want to suggest 4 things. One of them I've already talked about extensively in the last session, is that first one. That testimony about Jesus, first off, was copied accurately. This is really important because of the fact that if it was not copied accurately, obviously we can't trust it. So I want to suggest it was copied accurately. But I want to go through 3 other things. It was formulated soon after his death, and it circulated reliably. It was connected to eyewitnesses, and it was substantiated by independent accounts that agree in crucial details. And I know that's a little bit wordy and all of that, but what I'm basically saying, that I'm going to paraphrase now, that it wasn't very long after Jesus died that a clear story of what happened at his resurrection emerged, and people talked about it, and they weren't changing it. That it came from eyewitnesses, not from people 2nd or 3rd generation down, but it was through eyewitnesses. And there are different people that are independent of each other that tell about this, and what they tell, it agrees in some little details that wouldn't be fabricated. So that's what we're going to unpack in this last segment and looking at this. What can we know about the real Jesus? Now, before we go on, I want to give a time frame. I actually meant to get this earlier, but go to that next one. There's a timeline, and I wish would help us understand some of the time that we're talking about here. And I neglected to stick this one in the earlier one. So you've got about 30 A.D., somewhere around that, Jesus being crucified. Paul is converted about 3 years after Jesus is crucified, okay? Paul writes his first letter, the earliest letter, his letter to Galatians, about 16 years after that, in the year 49. Corinthians comes 55. 64 is the fire in Rome. And for the rest of these, I'm giving the latest possible dates in the range. Mid-60s is Mark's gospel. That's one we do know when it was written. There's a testimony of Papias who says that it was an early church father who tells us that it was written about this time in the mid-60s, Mark's gospel. The others we kind of have to make a guess on. Luke's and Matthew's gospel, somewhere between 70 and 90. John's gospel, sometime between 70 and 100. Now, the other Gospels, the earliest of the other Gospels, these Gospels that were not included in the New Testament because they couldn't be traced back to eyewitnesses, those don't come until later than this. And so it's important to recognize, sometimes people give the impression that these other books that were rejected were somehow just written about the same time, but they weren't. They were written after the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. So it's important that we recognize that. But I want to look at a claim that is a fairly typical claim about this on the next slide. This is also from Bart Ehrman. I use him because he is one of the most prominent and most eloquent attackers of the New Testament in this regard. And so I'm using him in using quotations from his books. This obviously is not what I'm claiming, but this is what he's claiming that we're going to respond and give an apologia in response to. Stories based on eyewitness accounts, he says, aren't necessarily reliable, and the same is true 100-fold for accounts that, even if stemming from reports of eyewitnesses, have been in oral circulation long after the fact. Imagine playing telephone over the expanse of the Roman Empire, 2,500 miles across, with thousands of participants from different backgrounds, with different concerns, and in different contexts over the course of decades. Now I want us to wrestle through. Let me put this back here. Wrestle through with what he has to say in this particular context. Let's look at the next slide, if we could, please. Now, one of the things he says, anybody played the game telephone? Yeah, all I've played that, where you whisper something to the next person, and I hated that game. I thought it was the stupidest game, and I would always make something up in the middle that would totally throw it off. So, I mean, it would be going around, and I would say, the teacher's hair looks like a mangy Wookiee's armpit, or something like that, and then it would go all the way around that way and come out with something really awesome on the other side, and this, I thought, was very amusing at the time. Heck, I still think it's amusing. But anyway, to make something up in the midst of that. But this game telephone, he likens it to this. And this was what he says. He says, look, these stories of Jesus, that's how they circulated. One person told another person, told another person, told another person, told another person, and it gets changed each time. And so even if the stories in the New Testament originally came from eyewitnesses, we can't rely on them. There's no way we can rely on them. People have changed them over decades. I don't think he's right on this, and I want to unpack why, but I also want you to recognize that in some ways how easily this can make sense. Because as I noted earlier, it's the 60s and the 70s AD, so 30 to 40 years after the time of Jesus, before the Gospels are written down. That's a long time. But I do believe that the stories are still reported accurately over that time period, and I want to demonstrate why. The first aspect of this is that in the culture of the first century, it was an oral culture. That is to say that people passed things down in stories that could be memorized and learned, and they could reliably circulate for decades. Now, this isn't even just in their century, their culture at their time. For example, in my own experience, there's a point at which we worked with the Lakota Indians in South Dakota. And there's a story that they have of the white buffalo calf woman. It's a great story. I won't go through the whole story, but it's this great story it's the story of the white buffalo calf woman. This story, to the best of my knowledge, has not been written down except in fairly recent years. This story has, though, through the storyteller of the tribe, from one generation to the next, has been passed on for generations. This happens in other contexts as well. In other words, we live in a written culture, so it's hard for us to imagine something going reliably from one generation to the next without being written down. But we're the exception on this. You go to other cultures around the world, and stories get passed down generation to generation to generation, and they aren't changed. They get passed down that way. They did that in the first century. Now, one thing I do want to point out in this is the difference between an oral tradition and an oral history. There's a difference between those. An oral history occurs only when the eyewitnesses are still alive. So it moves from oral history to oral tradition when the witnesses die out, the eyewitnesses. And so when we're talking about Jesus' time period, that all of it was still written during the lifetimes of eyewitnesses. Therefore, it's not oral tradition, it's an oral history. It's a history because the eyewitnesses are still alive at this time. So let's go on to the next slide. This is some more of the claim. When I put in that type of box, it's the claims that are being made. It says the New Testament Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death. Not by people who are eyewitnesses, but by people living later. That's a claim that we'll challenge in just a moment. After the days of Jesus, people started telling stories about him in order to convert others to the faith. Stories were changed with what would strike us today as reckless abandon. They were modified, amplified, and embellished, and sometimes they were just made up. That's the claim made about the Gospels. But I want to give a response to that. Again, bring up the next slide if you could, please. The strong evidence suggests that a stable history of the crucial events of Jesus' life emerged less than 3 years after his death, and that the essential content of this history remained unchanged as it spread across the Roman Empire. That's what we're going to be demonstrating in the rest of our time. Those are the charges that have been made. We're going to spend the rest of our time demonstrating that this circulated reliably. So let's jump in and understand more about the oral culture of the first century on the next slide. We're going to look at the oral culture of the first century. How did they learn things? How did they do things? Well, for example, Philo of Alexandria, he's a Jewish author of this time period. He says, instruction moves in a leisurely way. He lingers over it. It's what he's speaking about a teacher. Spins it out with repetition, thus permanently imprinting the thoughts in the hearers' souls. He says, that's how people teach in my day. He's not a Christian. He's not trying to talk about anything about Christianity. He's simply saying, here's the teaching method we use. And it's this. He says, we repeat it. We talk about it over and over until it's memorized and learned. Now, they would learn things, they would present them in sort of a rhythmic format in ways that had little different things, that had repetitions to remind you of different parts of them, and they would do so in such a way that it could be memorized and passed from one person to another, to another, to another, to another, and they would memorize these different little snippets of history and pass them on from one to another. In the oral culture of the first century, acts and teachings could be summarized in oral histories, and these reliably circulated over long periods of time. And I want to show you one of these that's in your New Testament. You have one in your New Testament. You just didn't know you had one of these oral histories like he's describing here. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So grab your Bibles, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and we're actually going to look at one of these. It's very clear. There's a handful of these in the New Testament, of these little snippets of oral tradition or oral history. And we're going to look at one of them and how we know it's that, and how it's circulated, and how we know it's not being changed in the way that's been claimed here. 1 Corinthians 15:3. We'll go through a handful of just really digging into this and demonstrating some very important things about it. First off, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." I'm going to stop there for just a little bit. He uses two Greek words there, paralambano and paradidomi. Now, that's the words for handed on and received. All right? That's what those words are for, is passed on or handed on and received. Those two words are technical terms, key terms, that are used in the first century for the purpose of saying this is an oral history we're passing on. This is a bit of tradition. Those are used to introduce that. When those two words are used together, it's a way of introducing something that has been learned and passed on in that way. That's how these terms are used in the first century. So it's passed on in that way. So what I delivered unto you, that which I also received, it is a way of affirming that I'm not changing anything that I'm passing on to you. I'm not changing it. I'm giving you exactly what I got, and here it is. Now, sort of as a sidelight in 1 Corinthians, one of the things that's important about that is, what is Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church? Is it on good terms or bad terms at this particular moment? You remember in the context here? Paul and the Corinthians are not always getting along with each other at this moment, all right? He has some pretty harsh words for them at different times. Now, think through this. I just want you to wrestle with this for a little bit. He's writing this letter in the year 55, approximately, somewhere around the year 55. It was several years ago that he visited this church. Now, he says, remember what I told you then. Remember what I told you then. I told you back then what I'm getting ready to tell you right now. Now, do you know what Paul cannot afford with the Corinthians? To be changing something. Because if he says, you know what, this is what I passed on to you, and one of them could say, no, it isn't. You changed something. He can't afford to do that at this point. You have good reason to believe that Paul has not changed this in the past several years. In other words, Paul has been passing on the tradition the same the whole time he's had it, because if he wasn't, the Corinthians would call him on it. They would call him on the carpet about it. So we can be very certain that Paul is not changing this. He says, so I passed on to you that which I also received, and then he begins to articulate this tradition, this history that he's passing on. He says here, that Christ, that the Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, then to James, the apostles, and he goes on in this list. Now, that repeated and that, it's a little odd sounding. It's more odd in Greek than it is even in English. It sounds a little bit more natural in English. It's coming from something that comes from another language, most likely Aramaic or Hebrew. Most likely Aramaic or Hebrew. Not only that, we've got another hint that it comes from an Aramaic source. Simon Peter's name is not given as Peter. It's given as Cephas. It's given as Cephas, not as Peter. It means the same thing. Cephas is rock, and so Peter is also, Petros is rock as well. So Simon Peter, son of John, John or Jonah would be his name. But Cephas in Aramaic. Cephas in Aramaic. So when on earth could Paul have gotten a tradition that didn't start in Greek, the language that he's writing in here? It started in Aramaic. There's only one place in the world that they speak Aramaic, and that's the places around Judea, Samaria, all of those areas. That's where they speak Aramaic. So if this is an Aramaic source, it comes from there. Well, lo and behold, that's precisely the area where Jesus lived, died, crucified, and claimed to have been raised from the dead. So it comes from the location where the events occurred. When could Paul have picked this up? Well, Paul's in Jerusalem around the year 35 is when he's in Jerusalem that he seems that he would have received this. It says in Galatians 1:17 that he interviewed, or the word there is hystereo, the very word we get history from. He interviewed. He wanted to get the facts about what had happened from Simon Peter. In the year 35, this is only 5 years at most after Jesus was crucified and claimed to have been raised from the dead. That Paul gets an Aramaic tradition that he isn't changing. Paul's traveling all around the ancient world, and he's repeating the same tradition over and over and over. And he's not changing it. He's not changing it. So let's look at the next slide. Here's what I want to point out with this. Passages like this suggest that accounts of the life of Jesus emerged early in the context of eyewitnesses and remained relatively unchanged as they spread across the Roman Empire. That's what we see in that. Now let's just suppose, and I don't believe what I'm getting ready to say to you, but I want you just to suppose it for a moment. Let's suppose that all that we had about Jesus and that was reliable was this one tiny snippet right here. Let's suppose that's all we had is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, and we had nothing else. Do you know something? If that's all we had, there is still every reason to trust in Jesus Christ as our only source of righteousness and hope, even if there was nothing else. Because he died for our sins, and he was raised from the dead, and people saw him afterwards. And even if that's all we had, there's every reason to trust the gospel, even if it's all we had. Do I think that's all we have? No, I'm not saying that that's all we have. But even if it were, we should run to Jesus and rest in him for our righteousness, even if this is all we had. We could and should do that. You have in your New Testament, you have an oral history that is reliable and is passed on from eyewitnesses from the very places where Jesus himself walked and talked. But there's more. There's more. So what we're trying to do on the next slide, just to remember where we're headed with this, is we believe that the testimony about Jesus was copied accurately, was formulated soon after his death, and circulated reliably. That's just what we've looked at now. It was connected to eyewitnesses and substantiated by independent accounts that agree in crucial details. Let's look at the next one. This is a charge against it that we're going to respond with an apologia. The Gospels that came to be included in the New Testament, Bart Ehrman writes, they're all written anonymously. When Christians recognized the need for apostolic authorities, they attributed the books to apostles, Matthew and John, close companions of the apostles, Mark, secretary of Peter, Luke, traveling companion of Paul. Scholars continue to call these books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as a matter of convenience. They have to be called something, and it doesn't make much sense to call them George, Jim, Fred, and Sam. So that's the claim right there, that these were all, they're written anonymously. Now, here's what's to understand about this. The reason he makes this claim, we can go into the next slide to see this. The reason he makes this claim is that it is true that some of the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels don't have any title on them. They don't have a title on them. It doesn't say anything about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They don't have the titles on them in the earliest ones. We know that because once titles start being added, the titles are slightly different at times. Now, he jumps from that and says that means they were written anonymously. Now, I want to say two things about that. One of them is that's not necessarily true, because do you remember what I said about how they tagged books in the ancient world when they were in their wine cellar thing, They put little leather strips on them and they wrote the names. It could just be that those little leather strips have been lost and rotted away over the years and that they were tagged. Now, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that wasn't the case, but I think it very possibly could have been the case. But I'll give the benefit of the doubt and say, let's just set that aside, because that we don't know for sure, and we want to be more certain in what we say. But there is still a very good reason to believe that these books were known to have come from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even from the beginning. And I want to demonstrate why we know that. Now, before I do that, I want to look at just kind of help you understand how these were circulating in the ancient world. So let's go to the next slide. Is a map right here. This is a map of the Roman Empire right here, and just just three different things, just so you understand the breadth of how far they were spreading, okay? In Rome, early to mid-2nd century, you've got Justin Martyr, who speaks of Mark's gospel as Peter's memoirs. You've also got the Muratorian fragment that I mentioned earlier that says about the third gospel. Their book is the gospel according to Luke. The fourth one is of John. So these people, by the mid-2nd century, they know about the gospels. They've got the gospels. Papias of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, he speaks of Mark's gospel and Matthew in the early 2nd century. He's aware of those. There's a fragment of John from the late 1st century called Papyrus 52 that was found all the way down in Egypt. So all I want you to see in that is that the New Testament books in the 2nd century had spread all over the world. We had hints of them from all over the world, the known world of that time period. There are hints of them all over the known world. Now, here's what, and this gets a little bit technical, so just jump in and try to follow me on this, because this is pretty important on this. Now, what Bart Ehrman says, he says, look, the titles are different on the Gospels. And they don't start having titles to the early 2nd century. So he says what happened was that as these books circulated, they just added titles onto them to make them seem like they came from apostles, and they didn't necessarily come from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. All they did is that they just added titles on to make them seem apostolic, to make them seem like they came from. Do you see the claim that's being made on that? He's saying that these books didn't have any titles at all, and they added names to make them seem like they were authoritative. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John just got added to them. Now keep that in your minds really firmly. That's the claim that's being made, is that they started adding titles in the 2nd century, and they chose those titles just to make the book seem authoritative, even though they didn't come from these at all. Now let's look at the next slide. Now, do you remember how far that the books had spread across the Roman Empire? And do you remember the claim is that they just started adding titles on? But let's suppose that would have happened. Let's suppose you've got all the way over in Rome, they have these 4 anonymous gospels with no titles. All the way over in Asia Minor, they have these 4 anonymous gospels. All the way down in Egypt, they have these 4 anonymous gospels. I remember no telephones, no email, not even telegraph, nothing like that they're operating with. What would you see in the manuscript evidence if they just started making up names? I'll tell you what, first off, they're not going to put Mark's name on one. They're not going to put Luke's name on one. But you'd see something else too. You'd probably see down in Egypt maybe that the 4 gospels would be called Andrew and Nathaniel, the gospel of Nathaniel, the gospel of Andrew, the gospel of Simon, the gospel of, but up in Asia Minor, you'd see them making up different names. So what we should see when we look at the manuscript evidence, if they've just fabricated titles, is there should be dozens of different ones of titles. You could probably find Gospels of Matthew with Peter's name on them and Andrew's name. Because they had no way of coordinating with each other to get the same name on these Gospels. They had no way to coordinate that, to get the same name on the Gospels. But do you know what you actually see? when you look at the manuscript evidence, every gospel according to Matthew, no matter where it comes from, that has a name added to it, it mentions Matthew. Every one of them mentions Matthew. None of them have Andrew or Peter or anybody else. It's always Matthew once they start adding the name. That doesn't matter if the manuscript is from Rome or from Asia Minor or Egypt or wherever it is. They always have Matthew's name on Matthew's gospel. Mark's name always ends up on Mark's gospel. Luke's name on Luke's gospel. John's name on John's gospel. That would not happen if they were fabricating names. So here's what happened. How on earth did people in Asia Minor, Rome, North Africa, all the way around the world, how on earth did they start adding names to the Gospels and happen to get the right names, the same names as everybody else all over the world? How did they get that? We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but I want you to see one thing first. Go to the next slide, please. If you look up there at this one, the top one says Kata Ioannein, according to John. Okay? According to John. The bottom one, though, says gospel according to John. What I want you to see in that is that's what the type of things you see. They'll have different titles, but they'll always have the same author listed. So, for example, in Matthew, sometimes you see just kata mataion, according to Matthew. Sometimes you see euangelion kata mataion, gospel according to Matthew. A couple of times you see the divine message of the gospel according to Matthew, this really long, convoluted title, but you always have Matthew on Matthew's gospel. You have John on John's gospel, Mark on Mark's gospel, Luke on Luke's gospel. The only way that could have happened is if each one circulated with an oral history saying, this is where it came from. So here's what I think happened, and I think there's evidence that this happened. When one church passes on a gospel to another church to be copied, when they passed it on, they told them the story behind it. They said, this gospel, it came from Mark, and Mark was Peter's interpreter, and that's how we got this gospel. And when that church passed it on to another church, they told the same story. And they told the same story. So by the time these thousands of manuscripts get all over the world, once they start feeling the need, we need to put titles on top of them so people can distinguish them, they know Matthew's gospel came from Matthew. Why? Because the church that gave us this gospel told us that. And the church that gave them that told them that. And we could trace all the way back to when this gospel was written, that's where it came from. And the same with every one of the Gospels. So when they passed on the Gospels, they didn't just pass on a text, they passed on a tradition that said this is where it came from. And it was a tradition that was traceable back to the very source of that gospel. And that's what they were doing. That's what they were doing when they passed the gospel on. They circulated a consistent oral history with every one of the gospels, connecting its content to an eyewitness source. And you know what? Not only can we conjecture that, there's evidence of it. Let's look at the next slide. This is actually from early 2nd century. Papias of Hierapolis says, Mark, Peter's interpreter, he reports this, says, this is what I was told, this is the oral history came about this, wrote accurately as much as he remembered, though not in ordered form, of the Lord's sayings and doings. Matthew, in the Hebrew dialect, it's a little bit uncertain what that means, placed sayings in orderly arrangement. But what he's saying in that is, this is when I got these gospels, this is the story that was passed on with these. We don't have it just from Papias. We've got it from others. Go to the next one, if you could, please. Polycarp lived in the late 1st, early 2nd, and into the mid-2nd century. Irenaeus records his words toward the end of the 2nd century. He says, Matthew composed his gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and building up the church there. After their deaths, Mark, Peter's follower and interpreter, handed down to us Peter's proclamation in written form. Luke, Paul's companion, wrote in a book the gospel proclaimed by Paul. Lastly, John composed the gospel while living in Ephesus. Not only that, I mentioned earlier the Muratorian fragment on the next one. The 3rd book of the gospel is according to Luke, he says. The 4th is the one of John. And then he has the passage I referenced earlier. Hermas composed The Shepherd quite recently, in our times in Rome. So while it should be read, it ought not be read publicly for the people of the church. It's not counted among the apostles, for it is after their time. once again, go to another one. Tertullian of Carthage, late 2nd century, reports this tradition being passed on about the Gospels. The Gospel testimony has apostles for its authors. There are some that, though not apostles, are apostolic. They don't stand alone. They appear with and after the apostles. So John and Matthew, of the apostles, first instill faith into us, while the apostolic writers, Luke and Mark, renew it afterwards. Notice this emphasis on those who actually walked and talked with Jesus. Those have preeminence always in the mind of the early church. Never mind that there occurs some variation in the arrangement of their narratives, as long as there is agreement in essential matters of faith. The Gospels can be traced back to eyewitnesses. I want you to see it's so important. They didn't come up with the Gospels later on the basis of conjecture and making things up. They could trace them from the very beginning back to eyewitnesses. Now, the last point I want to make has to do with independent testimonies. All we're going to look at is just the resurrection, because as you've kind of probably guessed by now, I think the resurrection is pretty important, okay? You may have guessed that by now, but I think it's pretty important, and so we keep going back to it quite a bit. And I want us to look at the independent testimonies about the resurrection. And going back to something I mentioned earlier, if you're in a court of law and you have 4 witnesses who tell the same story, and they tell it word for word the same, you're going to be suspicious. But if you have 4 witnesses who tell essentially the same story, but it's slightly different, that's pretty good. But if you have 4 witnesses, 3 or 4 witnesses who tell the same story, and not only do they tell the same story and they agree in essential details, but there's 1 or 2 odd, quirky details that all of them report that nobody would make up. That's when you rely on it. I want to demonstrate to you that that's what we see in the resurrection accounts. We've already looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Notice the essential truths there. The crucifixion, he's raised on the 3rd day, and many people saw him alive. Mark 16, I'm going to give the skeptic the benefit of the doubt. I'll only count Matthew, Mark, and Luke as 1 witness instead of 3, okay? Because I think that Matthew and Luke are reliant on Mark. That's like the witnesses that give almost word for word the same thing. So I'll say they're reliant on it and count that, give that only 1 vote. 1 vote. Those are written between 65 and 69, Mark is, based on an earlier tradition most likely. Crucifixion, resurrection on the 3rd day, and this is what I want us to see, Mary Magdalene as first witness. This is not something you would fabricate. This is essential in this. You would not fabricate a female witness in the 1st century. In Jewish court, a woman can't testify at all. In Roman court, a woman can testify only under very narrow circumstances that are very clearly defined and limited. If you're going to fabricate something, you're not going to fabricate a woman as the first witness. And yet you've got that little odd detail in Mark. But then look at John. And John shows no evidence of having been dependent on Matthew, Mark, or Luke. If you read John, it just reads differently. It doesn't look like he's borrowing at all. In fact, in all of John's gospel, there's scarcely about 1 phrase that you could even find that is exactly like Matthew, Mark, and Luke in any way, shape, or form. He's not drawing from Matthew, Mark, or Luke. He's independent. Crucifixion, resurrection on the 3rd day, and Mary Magdalene is first witness. Odd little detail. Completely independent, and both report it. Now, Mark 16, 9 through 20, we talked about that a little bit earlier. I'm not going to count that as a witness either, because I think it comes too late. I'm totally going to give the skeptic the benefit of the doubt on this. We do have one that's sometimes called the Gospel of Peter, but it's just Papyrus Cairo 10759. It's a text that's part of a gospel that I don't think belongs in the New Testament, but it is a testimony that is very early, and it's totally independent of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or Corinthians. It's a totally different There's none of the wording that's borrowed. It is completely independent, this fragment of a gospel. And it has, lo and behold, crucifixion, resurrection on the third day, and that odd little detail of Mary Magdalene as first witness. That's pretty important. When it comes to the resurrection, you have 4 separate traditions that emerge completely separately that have the crucifixion and the resurrection on the third day. 3 of those have a detail that nobody would make up. Now, in any other looking at history, that's pretty clear evidence that an event happened. When people look at this, they want to come up with all sorts of other things. But that's pretty clear. When you have multiple independent witnesses to the same event that agree in some sort of an odd detail that nobody would make up. I want us to unpack this a little bit more. This is something that even a skeptic admits. I find fascinating on the next slide. He says all of our early Gospels, not just John and Mark, with Matthew and Luke as well, but also Gospel of Peter, which appears to be independent of all of them, indicate it was Mary Magdalene who discovered Jesus' empty tomb. It seems hard to believe that this just happened by a fluke of storytelling. It seems much more likely that, at least with the traditions involving the empty tomb, we're dealing with something actually rooted in history. Now, this individual is a skeptic who goes on to deny that it was resurrection. He rejects the resurrection. But he says we're dealing with something rooted in history, even as he denies it. Denies that it was a resurrection. He says it has to be something else, not a resurrection. Not a resurrection. But what I want to suggest is that, on the next slide, if the most consistent historical evidence fits with a miraculous event, there's every reason to believe it happened. There's every reason to believe that the miraculous event happened. One last thing that I want us to look at in this, and that is the minute likelihood that anybody would have worshiped a God who had been crucified unless something as momentous as a resurrection occurred. Did you know that the word crucify was a bad word in the ancient world? It's a bad word. There's a document in which there's a prostitute who has a client who has wronged her, and as he walks out the door, she says, "Go crucify yourself." It's a bad word. You don't see it in polite literature in any way, shape, or form. They'll call it the ultimate penalty. They call it the extreme penalty. They'll call it the criminal beam. They'll call it all sorts of other things, but they won't use the word crucify. It's a bad word. You see the vulgarity of it. This is from Roman philosopher Seneca. I see the stakes there, not of one kind, but many. Some victims are placed head down. Some have spikes driven through their genitals. Others have their arms stretched out on the gibbet. The Romans did all sorts of different variations on crucifixion simply to strike terror in the faces of people so that they would see that through this is what we, the Roman Empire, will do to you if you rebel against us. This is what we'll do. And they would come up with horrific ways to crucify people. You couldn't crucify a Roman citizen. You had to be somebody who was not a Roman citizen even to be crucified. But it was a form of state terrorism for them to be able to frighten and terrify people. In fact, on the next slide, this is one of the first bits of graffiti. Yes, they did graffiti even in the ancient world. This is one of the first bits of graffiti that has anything to do with Christians. 2nd century probably. It says on there, Alexamenos sebete theon, just as minor point of obscure humor, that they even misspelled graffiti at that time. It should be spelled sebetai, not sebete. But anyway, they even misspelled. They couldn't even spell when they did graffiti back then. And so on this you see, on a cross, a naked man with the head of a donkey. And what Alexamenos sebete theon means is Alexamenos, name worships his God. This is making fun of somebody. This is found in slaves' quarters in the Palatine Hill in Rome. This is making fun of somebody who worships Christ. Alexamenos worships his God. He's a Christian. They worship a crucified God. What idiots. They worship a crucified God. Might as well be worshiping a donkey upon a cross as to worship a God who's done that. And once you see the vulgarity and the awfulness of crucifixion in the ancient world, do you seriously think, apart from a resurrection, anybody's going to come up with the idea that let's worship a guy who was on a cross? Do you seriously think that somebody's going to think, oh, this is a good idea for a new religion? Let's come up with a new religion of a guy who's crucified. Nobody's going to come up with that. Apart from something so momentous as a resurrection, such that they are shaken from anything that would keep them from this. And they say, we will worship a God even who was crucified. That's where Christianity emerges from. And what I want us to see, and I believe that we do see in this so clearly, is that multiple independent witnesses testify to the truth of Christianity, the truth of the cross and of the empty tomb, and that it's not something anyone would have fabricated ever. It's not something they would have fabricated. It's not something they would have made up. When we look at the resurrection, there's very strong evidence for it. And so what we call people to is, what do you do with the empty tomb? What do you do with that? The church may have messed up. You may have been wronged. You may wrestle with how the world was created or why there's evil in the world. But what do you think of the empty tomb? What do you think of that? And if indeed the tomb was vacated by somebody who had been previously murdered upon a cross, if indeed that's the case, what are you going to do with Jesus? What will you do with this man? What will you do with this one who is clearly more than a man? What do you do with Jesus? And in apologetics, that's where we keep running to over and over and over, is what are you going to do with the empty tomb? What are you going to do with Jesus?